I'm Dr. Mohammad Rafi, Associate Professor, Department of Cybersecurity at Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. Today, I want to discuss about UDP client server applications. Here, UDP client server. The application here in this UDP client server, the application, both the client side and server side. Now we have to create the socket. Here, with help of these other sockets, we can sending the message or we can receive the message. Here, server side of the socket now, which is receive the message from the client side of the socket, which is sending the request to the server. If the server is giving the response and reply, then send the other message and establish the other communication. Here is now whatever the socket here, whatever the data which is the sending, which is receiving the message, receive the message from the client. Here wait for the datagram arrival blocked and the process the request. Whatever the request is the receiving, these the request can be processed and reply depends upon the request. The request can be processed with the server after completing the process now, which is sending the reply. Once if it is send the reply, the client now which is receives the reply from the server, and once if the communication is completed, the connection will be closed. The message is transferred and received successfully from the server. Now the connection will be closed. So this is a communication UDP client server, the application now. With help of this the application now, so the communication can be established from client to server, server to client. Here is this can be done wireless. So this can be done, the communication can be done without wires. It is not a connection oriented. So with help of this UDP the protocol, user datagram the protocol now, so we can done the communication from client to the server and server to the client effectively established. Once the communication is completed, now we can close the connectivity between the server and client. That means sockets will be closed. Once the sockets will be closed, the sockets with help of these the sockets only we can receive the message or we can send the other message. Once if it is closed here, we can't send the message to the server and we can't receive the request from the server. And the problem is exploiting the required socket functions for implementing the UDP client server application. Now, while implementing the UDP client server application, so what are the socket functions are required? Here, while implementing the UDP client server application, requires the several socket functions to managing the other communication. Here are the essential the functions and their rules. Or first function is at UDP server side the socket the function. Here mainly these the socket the function can be first we have to create it. Why we are creating this other socket function means now with help of this other socket other function we can communicate the information. That means now we can sending the information or we can receive the other information. Here is this the socket can be created both the at client side and server side. At the server side, the first the functionality is a socket, which is creating the socket. The syntax for creating the socket at server side is int socket int domain, on which domain now we are going to creating, and int type, which type of that other domain, and protocol, which other type of the protocol you are using. For example, here the int socket fd, socket file descriptor, socket of the syntax as per the syntax, socket of the domain. The domain is AF INET family. Here is UDP, whatever the several whatever the socket now we are creating. So these are the socket is belongs to the AF INET family, and type is a datagram. Now socket datagram type now we are utilizing. Why? Because now the protocol we are using the protocol that is a UDP, that is 0, which indicates the UDP protocol. Here 0 indicates the user datagram of the protocol. The type of the protocol is a SOC datagram protocol. This is the type of the protocol. Suppose now if you use the TCP the protocol, and TCP protocol now we can utilize the int the protocol is a 1. If it is a TCP, now we can write the 1. If it is a UDP, we can write the 0. If it is UDP, we can write the 0. So this is about the socket the function, and the bind. Generally at server side, these are the bind the function now, which is binds the socket to an address and port number. Here is now always now which is identify the client. How it is identifying the client? With help of the address and port number, the client address and port number. For example, the address of the client is 192.162.0.1. So it is a address of the client which is receiving message, and the port number. The port number is 1204 is the port number of a client. 1204 is a port number of a client. For that now, for binding the socket now, the syntax is int bind int socket fd file descriptor construct structure socket address, which is the address is a pointer type, and socket length, that is a length of the socket, that is a address length, which is specify the address length. For example, now we can write the socket structure type. Socket address is a structure data type at server side. Here is server address dot sin family. That means here, so AF INET, here is the domain is a AF INET. AF INET is nothing but a domain of the socket. The domain, that means address the family internet domain. It will be assigned to the server address dot sin the family, and INADDR, so which will be assigned to the server address sin address family, and server dot sin the port number. Here is H2N. H2N, these are the port the number can be assigned. So this the port number, it is merged with the address sin family. And binding, so which is the binding the address of the host, socket address, and the port number, both now which is the binding. By binding the address and the port number, so which identify the zone particular other device. Particular the client can be identified with help of this the binding only the effectively transfer the other messages. And receive from. So receive from is a other function. So that can be receive the messages from the so and so particular the identified other client, which is receiving the message from a socket. That is from a socket means here the socket is a client socket. Receive from can be utilized at server side. Now which is receiving the message from the client socket. So the client socket also now we are utilizing the UDP protocol here. That is a user datagram protocol now we are utilizing. The syntax is S size T receive from int socket FD void the buffer size length flag structure socket address which is the pointer type and socket length that is a address length that is a pointer type. So buffer size here the port number 1024 is a buffer size. Now we are mentioning the port number of that so and so particular other device. And here socket address in client address, socket address struck socket address in client address. That means now socket length len size of client address. Receive from that is socket FD buffer size 0 structure socket address pointer type at the rate of the other client other length. So we are receiving the information from the other client. That is with help of this other receive other function. Now we can receive the information from the client. Send to function. So this send to function now actually which is utilized sending a message to a socket. So which socket we are going to sending the message now here actually which is sending the message to the client socket. Once the message is received from the other client, now which is process the message. After completion of this the process, now which is sending the message in the form of the reply to the client host. That means the syntax for this one is we can write it as a socket size. Here is the socket size. Send to int socket file descriptor. So this is a syntax. And the buffer size that is a length and flag. How many other flag bits? Flag bit is a 0 or 1. If it is a 0 now flag bit generally we are utilizing the UDP as a protocol. And construct structure type that is a socket address will be structure type which is the pointing to the destination address. Whatever the host, whatever the destination now which is pointing to the destination address and socket length address length. For example, send to socket FD message string length message 0 construct structure type socket address that is the client ADDR LEN length. After once the communication is effectively completed from the client to server and server to other client, now we can close the connectivity between the client and server. By using the close function, the connectivity will be closed. Closes the socket connection. The syntax for this one is int close int socket file descriptor. The example is close socket file descriptor. Particular whatever the communicating file is there, that file can be closed. And the UDP client side. So client side also now, both the server side, client side now we have to create the sockets. Why? Because with help of these the sockets only, now we can establish the communication. Here creates the sockets. For that, creating the socket at client side or server side, both are the same. The syntax is same. the syntax is int socket, int the domain, int the type, int the protocol. So this is the other syntax. For example, now you can write it as a int file descriptor. Once the communication is completed, whatever the socket you have created, whatever the file descriptor you have created, it will be closed. That is socket AF INET. It is a domain of the socket. Which type of the the domain we are going to utilizing for effective communication. That is a domain is a address family INET. Internet the domain. That means int type. Int type is the type is a datagram type. The protocol is a UDP protocol. Now int the protocol means which is 0. If it is a TCP protocol, we can use the 1. So this is about the socket with help of this other function. Now we can create the socket. Send to function. The client what will do, which is sending the message from client to the server. That means send a message to the socket. This socket is a server socket. Server socket. Here the syntax for sending the message is s size send to int socket fd constant void. So the buffer is a pointing type, where in which location now we are going to pointing. So which is pointing the particular memory the buffer. That means here the size the size is a t. Here the size underscore, that is a length of the buffer, int flag, and construct structure type. Socket address is a structure type, now which is pointing to the destination address. The destination address here, the socket length which is the address of the particular the message, that is a socket length now, which specifies the address length of the socket. The example now, structure data type. We are utilizing the structure as the data type for specifying the socket address. And server, it is a SIN family. Server, that is address.sin as the family. Now AF the family which is assigned to the SIN family. And here also the server address .sin address underscore ADDR, that is a INET address. The address is 127.0.1. So this is the address of the INET. Whatever the address is there, it will be assigned to the SIN other family. And port number H2N, host the port number, so it will be assigned to the SIN port number. Server SIN the port number. Once the SIN or the server SIN port number if you assign, so it will be bind the address and port number. Now which is binding the address plus port number. With help of this and address and port number, which can identify the destination, which can identify the particular device. After identifying the particular device, now which is send to socket fd message, string length message, that is 0, construct structure socket address, that is a server ADDR, size of server ADDR. Here is receive from. Receive from is nothing but a receive a message from a socket. That means now what it is doing, which is receiving the message from the socket. S size underscore t, which is receiving. That means int socket fd, void star buffer, size underscore t, length, int flags, struck socket address, that is pointing the socket address, the length of the socket address. For example, here the buffer, character buffer 1024. Here is the port number 1024, is the size of the buffer, which is equal to, now we are specifying as the port in terms of the character. Char buffer 1024. Struct address underscore in server address. Server address now, which is a structure type. And next socket length underscore the t, that is a length size of the server address, which specifies the size of the server address. And receiving from the socket the file the descriptor the buffer, whatever the data, whatever the information we have stored, now it will be received. That is depends upon the size of the buffer. So UDP here 0 is nothing but a UDP int the protocol. That means UDP protocol. UDP protocol. With the help of this UDP protocol, now we are receiving the message. So which indicates 0 indicates. Here is the struct socket address and the server address and the length of the socket. So this is the example for the receiving from. Once receives the data, and once the client is receives the responses from the server, now simply we can close the connection. Closes the socket. Now, for example, is a close socket file descriptor. Whatever the file descriptor we have created, that file descriptor will be closed once the communication is completed. The syntax for this one, int close into socket to FD. Socket to FD. So example workflow. Server side here. Server side. Create a socket using the socket function. Bind the socket to an address using bind function. Receives the data from a client using the receive from. And send a response to the client using the send to function. Closing the socket using the close other function. Here is the server side. Now the workflow generally will do at the server side, and the client side also. Now the workflow is creating the socket by using socket function, and also send the data to the server using the send to function. Receiving a response from the server using the receive from other function, and closing the socket using close function. Here is, by using these other functions, you can implement a basic UDP client server application to facilitate the communication over a network. Next, the problem statement is design and implementation of a simple UDP client server application. Here is, the server should listen for a message from clients and reverse the received message and send it back to the client. The client should send a message to the server and display the reversed message which was received from the server. Here is, for that the solution is the code, server code at Python side, the import socket. Now define the start server, define the server address and port. Here is the local host is the port of the, it is a local host, it is a generally now we can utilize for the address of that other server and port number of the other server. So it will be assigned to the server as a server address. Server address is address plus port number. Now which is binding, the socket will be bind it as a address plus port number. So with these two combinations, now the server address can be considered along with the port number, creating the UDP sockets. And for that the function is sock.socket, socket.afinet, socket datagram. So this is the socket creating the UDP sockets. Binding the socket to the address. Sock.bind server address, print f server, so is running on a server address while it is a true, receiving the message from the client and also receiving the data, so and so port number. This is the host, this is a client of client host. From this client, now we are receiving the data. Data will be received and it will, whatever the data now we have received, so along with the address. Now by identifying the address, now we can receive the data. So received message. So whatever the message is the received, that can be the decoded from the address or specified address. So reverse the received message. Once the message is the received from the other client, now the server what it is doing, so which is the process and reversing back to the other client. Original message can be client reversing to the other client and sending back to the client. Reverse the message, that is a data dot decoding. With help of the decoding, now it will be reverse. -1, which is indicate the -1 symbol. Double colon -1, which is decoding. Reverse the message decoding. Sending the reverse message back to the client. That is socket send to reverse message encoding. That will be encoded. Encoding decoding techniques can be utilized here. And by encoding decoding, now securely we can transfer the data. Client side also it is a code at the client side, and client side also defining the server address and the port number. Server address and port number. Here client side also now we are writing the local host IP address and port number is a 123450. It will be assigned to the server address at client side, creating the UDP socket. Here is the function for this one is socket AFnet. This is a domain of the socket, and socket dgram is a type of the socket now, which is trying to sending the messages to the server. So with help of this the message, now we are entering the data input function. Now with help of this input function we can enter the data, and after that sending the message encoding. While sending the message now from client to the server, here we have to encode the message. Why we are going to encoding means, now the secure data, we have to transfer the secure data with help of this the code here. Data dot here, that is a socket received. That means from this the code from this the port number, now it will be the received. Here the server, generally the socket creation can be done. After that binding the address and the port number, and messages can be handled. Binding can be done, socket will be created. So creating the UDP sockets with the INET family, and the data type is a socket dgram the data type. Here is the server binds the socket to the local host on the port 12345. Client code. So client code means socket creation. The client creates the UDP socket, which is similar to the server. Message sending. Message sending, that means the client send a message to the server, so which is waiting for the response. Response handling means, now which is reverse, receives the reversed message from the server and displayed it. Here the basic example. Now this can be demonstrated how to set up the UDP client server, that exchanging and manipulating the messages between the client and the server. For this the topic, the textbooks are the computer network, a top down, the approach by James. Here this is the textbook, and reference book Unix network, the programming volume 1, and these are the web reference. So this is about the UDP client server, the applications. Thank you.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.